Officer Doyle slammed Angela Brooks against the pavement, his voice dripping with hate. Know your place. The crowd froze in horror. No one dared move. No one knew the truth. Angela stayed silent, but not out of fear. She was waiting, because in one shocking moment, this ordinary woman would turn the entire street upside down. What happens when a racist cop realizes the woman he humiliated is the governor of the state? If this hits you, like and share so more people feel the power of this moment. Now let's dive into the story. I was there that noon when the heat sat heavy over our little southern town and the main drag shimmered like a griddle. People moved fast, heads down, black folks with that careful pace you learn when eyes are on you. White folks clustered in doorways, trading looks that said more than words. The air had a sound to it, a kind of hush that pretends to be quiet, but is really fear, keeping its voice low. She came from the bus stop, Angela Brooks, though I didn't know her name then. Mid-40s, maybe plain blouse. Flats, a tote hugged close to her side. Nothing flashy. She walked like someone who'd learned to fit the edges of a place, like she could pass through a crowd without leaving ripples. If you weren't paying attention, you might have missed her. Most people did, but Officer Ray Doyle didn't. Doyle's hard to miss himself, big shoulders, shaved jaw, 40-something, with a face that looks carved out of one bad decision after another. He was already chewing out 2 black teens for loitering move, along find something useful to do, the usual empty thunder people let him get away with. He likes a stage, Doyle. Likes it best when the stage can't answer back. Angela slowed near the storefront where the boys stood. She didn't interfere, didn't raise her voice. Just looked steady, clear, the way a grown woman looks at a problem and measures it. The boys noticed. So did I. So did Doyle. He turned because he could feel he was losing his audience. His eyes tracked the sidewalk, then locked on her like a searchlight. I swear I saw his shoulders lift the way a dog lifts its hackles. Hey, he called too loud for the distance between them. Where are you heading? She didn't pretend not to hear. She met him halfway, 3 small steps, the kind that say, I am not running and I am not afraid. Home, she said. One word. Calm. No echo of challenge in it, but no apology either. Doyle smiled without warmth. He likes puzzles with obvious answers. Home, he repeated like the idea offended him. His hand set down on his duty belt thumb, hooked near the holster, the old pantomime. The boys went quiet. A couple of white men in work shirts edged closer to the door, making space that didn't need making. A woman tightened her grip on her child's wrist. Angela kept walking, not toward him, just toward where her day meant to go, before it was interrupted. So Doyle moved to intercept. 2 big strides, and he was there, planting his boots so wide he was a doorway you couldn't get through. Who do you think you are? He said, voice roughened by the heat and his own importance. Walking like you own this street? I felt the crowd breathe in. That's a sound you don't forget, everybody swallowing at the same time. Someone behind me muttered, don't do it, and I don't know whether they meant don't answer him or don't become another story. Angela didn't flinch. She set her tote higher on her shoulder. Up close, I could see a small sheen at her temple from the sun, and something else in her eyes focused maybe. Like a person solving a math problem they already know the answer to. This is a public sidewalk, she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but the street gave it room. I'm going home. Doyle took a half step, enough to make the message plain. Your home is wherever I let you have it. He shifted again, just a fraction, a block of stone sealing a passage. The 2 teens looked at the ground. A delivery truck rumbled somewhere far off. The town held still. He leaned closer. You walk when I say you walk. That did it. The woman beside me whispered Lord, and someone else let out a breath that sounded like a prayer trying to escape. Angela looked past him, not through him, past him to the space he was stealing. I'll be on my way, she said, and she took 1 step. Not wide, not fast, just a step. It was enough to say, I have business that isn't you. Doyle's palm touched her shoulder as if to guide. Only it wasn't a guide. It was a push, not hard enough to knock her down, but hard enough to say, I can. The kind of touch that burns because it's not about contact, it's about claim. Her heels slid on the warm concrete, and she caught herself weight-forward tote pressed to her side so nothing spilled. A little black girl near the bench started to cry, that hiccuping sound kids make when they Don't understand the rules, but know someone just broke one. Angela turned her face toward the crying, the smallest tilt, and for the first time her voice changed. Not louder, steadier. There's no need for that, she told Doyle. He smirked, the expression he puts on when he thinks the scene is his. He shifted again, seal-tight shoulders square. His words came out like gravel. You think this is your street? Something in the heat cracked then. It wasn't a noise. It was a feeling the moment a crowd commits to watching, because they know if they look away now, the story will rewrite itself in the mouths of liars. Phones came up. Not many at first, then more. A white woman in a floral blouse glanced at her husband, then stepped forward a pace, not close enough to interfere, just close enough to be counted. Angela's hand stayed at her side. She didn't reach for her phone, didn't reach for anything. She breathed once, a long, quiet breath that sanded the edge off fear, and said, I'm going to walk. That was the second the air turned to glass. Doyle moved one boot forward, body-blocking arm cutting across the space where her step should be. Not an arrest, not yet. A claim. The line where a man decides he'll write the ending because he wears a badge and a gun in the habit of winning. The boys stared. The flowered blouse woman's mouth opened, then closed again. I felt the sun pressing down and the crowd pulling in the way weather tightens before it breaks. Nothing about Angela screamed danger. Nothing about her begged mercy. She stood as if she'd stood in doorways like this her entire life, doors built to keep her out, that she'd learned to pass through anyway. We're done here, Doyle said, edge of triumph in it. And then this is where the sidewalk stopped being a street and became a stage. The world narrowed to a corridor of heat and silence. Angela's eyes lifted not to his face, but to the space behind him, the simple, stubborn fact of a way forward. She didn't smile. She didn't plead. She didn't glance around for rescue. She shifted her weight for another step. That's when the crowd truly froze, mid-breath, mid-blink, mid-life, because everyone understood at once one woman's step would decide what kind of town we were, what kind of people we were willing to be, and how far a uniform could reach into an ordinary day and claim it. And Doyle, feeling the eyes on his back and the phones in the air, planted himself harder, shoulders squared like a wall that wanted to be permanent. The heat had a taste then, metallic, like a coin on the tongue. I heard my own pulse. I heard the little girl's hiccups. I heard the scrape of Doyle's boot and the soft rasp of Angela's breath. That was the moment everything held still, before words turned into orders, before touches turned into force, before the first line broke and all the others followed. You people never learn. Doyle's voice cracked through the air like a whip. Before I could even blink, his hand seized Angela's wrist, twisting it back with brutal precision. In one violent jerk, he bent her arm up behind her, forcing her down until her knees buckled under the weight of his grip. The motion was fast, cruel, and practiced. Angela's face hovered just inches above the blistering pavement. I could hear her breath catch a sound sharp enough to cut. Her tote slipped from her shoulder, tumbling to the ground, a small paperback sliding across the sidewalk like an afterthought. The crowd erupted. Stop, someone shouted. She didn't do anything, cried a woman with panic in her voice. Others gasped, cursed, raised their phones higher. The collective sound of disbelief rolled through the street like thunder chasing lightning. Angela did not scream. She did not beg. She pressed her lips together and held her silence. You could almost see the thought move across her face like a shadow. Let them show themselves. Let the world see what they are when they think no one matters. Her silence was louder than any cry could have been. And then came Hansen. Officer Hansen stood a few feet away, arms folded across his chest, his expression carved in stone. He wasn't startled. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. He looked at Angela pinned against the street as if he had seen it 100 times before and accepted it as ordinary. When he finally spoke, his words came out flat, sharp, and merciless. Could be worse, he muttered. The words sent a chill up my spine. Not because they were shouted, but because they were casual. Cruelty, when spoken without effort, has a weight all its own. Some in the crowd heard him, and I saw heads snap in his direction, faces twisting in horror. One woman clapped her hand over her mouth. A man near me whispered, "My God," but his voice was drowned in the rising noise. Doyle's grip only tightened. He yanked Angela upright, twisting her arm high behind her back. She winced barely, but the strain was clear. Metal cuffs glinted in the sunlight as he snapped them around her wrists. The ratcheting click of steel locking shut seemed louder than the passing traffic, louder than the cries of the crowd. That sound carried finality, humiliation, ownership. Hands behind your back, Doyle barked, though her hands were already locked tight in iron. The sight of her standing there, wrist-bound, chin lifted despite the pain. It landed like a stone in our chests. I'll never forget it. A black woman in broad daylight, cuffed like a criminal, when all she had done was walk down her own street. The little black girl by the bench sobbed harder now, burying her face into her mother's waist. The mother bent low, whispering frantically, trying to calm her child without drawing Doyle's attention. The boys Doyle had been yelling at earlier stood stiff, eyes wide, the phones in their hands, recording their expressions, torn between terror and defiance. And the white woman in the floral blouse, her lips parted, trembling. She turned to her husband, who shook his head as if warning her to stay quiet. But she didn't step back. She stayed where she was, frozen but present, as though her silence was already breaking in her chest. Angela raised her head. Her wrists were chained, her body bent slightly by the hold, but her eyes swept across the street. She didn't look for sympathy. She didn't look for help. She looked at us like she was reminding us we were witnesses, and that carried its own burden. Her silence was terrifying Doyle more than 1,000 words could have. I saw the way his jaw tightened, how he jerked her forward like she was something to be displayed. He shoved her a step, almost parading her in front of the crowd as though to remind us who controlled the street. But the crowd was no longer his. Shouts rose louder, angrier. Let her go. She's done nothing. That's assault. The phones didn't shake now. They held steady. A man muttered, "He's finished," while capturing every second. The current in the air had shifted. What Doyle thought was dominance had become evidence. Angela swayed slightly under his push, but she steadied herself with a grace that stunned me. She did not collapse into the moment he had created for her. She stood inside it, reshaping it with her calm. Even cuffed, even humiliated, she did not let him own her dignity. And in that contrast, his rage against her silence, his violence against her poise, the injustice sharpened into something unbearable. That was the first climax. You could feel it in the way the crowd sucked in air, in the cries that overlapped, in the tremors of fury shaking through people's voices. The humiliation was complete, public, undeniable. Doyle had chained Angela Brooks in the middle of Main Street, under the sun and in front of the town. And all of us knew we were looking at more than a woman in handcuffs. We were looking at the truth of power gone rotten. The fury in the air was thick enough to choke on. I felt it grip me by the throat. My eyes stung, not from the heat, but from the raw ache of watching dignity pressed into the dirt. No one in that crowd would ever forget what they saw. The handcuffs clinked as Doyle jerked Angela forward, parading her like a trophy. The crowd rippled with fury, voices rising, like a storm breaking loose. You could feel the moment the line was crossed, not just for Angela, but for everyone watching. A young man in the back cursed loud enough for the whole street to hear. Another shouted, "Let her go," and took a step forward. The air shifted, bodies leaning as if to surge. Doyle snapped his head toward us, his face red with authority and rage. He lifted his free hand palm out, his other still clamped hard on Angela's arm. "Anyone moves," he barked, his voice slicing through the uproar. "You'll be next." The words landed like a threat wrapped in iron. You could feel the hesitation ripple through people, that awful pause when courage and fear collide. Then came Samuel. An old black man, bent with age but still upright, pushed forward from the sidewalk. His hands trembled, but his voice, though quaking, cut through the noise. "Don't fight them," he said, his eyes burning under heavy brows. "Record everything, every second. They can't erase the truth if we keep it." His words hit like a match. Suddenly the air filled with the sound of dozens of phones clicking, recording, live streaming. The metallic glare of lenses and screens lit up the street. A chorus of tiny digital beeps and taps echoed over Doyle's threats, louder than the silence of fear. The street had found its weapon, not fists but eyes. People lifted their phones higher, braver now. A teenager muttered, "Get his badge number," and zoomed in on Doyle's chest. Another man whispered, "Send it live. Send it now." The crowd was no longer just watching. It was bearing witness. And then from the other side of the street, a new voice rang out, unexpected, sharp. A white woman in a floral blouse, the same one who had trembled earlier, suddenly broke away from her husband's grasp. Her heels clattered on the pavement as she stepped forward, her hands shaking, but her chin lifted. "This isn't right," she cried. The words hung there for a beat, shocking even herself. But then they spread. Someone else echoed her. "She didn't do anything," a third voice joined. "We won't stay quiet." For the first time, the crowd was no longer divided by silence. It was bound together by outrage. Black and white, young and old voices layered until the noise rolled like thunder through the street. Doyle tightened his grip on Angela's jaw, clenched. He tugged her forward as if dragging her away would drown out the rising tide behind him. But the tide only grew, and Angela did not resist. Her wrists remained bound, her steps forced, but her head stayed high. She didn't twist, didn't fight against the pull. Instead, she walked with the quiet dignity of someone carrying more than her own burden. Every stride seemed to say, "This shame is not mine. It belongs to them." People saw it. You could see it in their faces, the way anger melted into something deeper, reverence. It wasn't just that Angela was being humiliated. It was that she stood as if she carried the humiliation for all of us. For every shove, every insult, every time someone was told to bow their head and keep moving. The old man Samuel's eyes glistened as he kept shouting, "Record her face. Record his face." "Don't let them hide this." Phone's tilted flashes caught Doyle's sneer. Hanson's cold indifference. Angela's steady eyes. The images burned into pixels, into memory, into history. And as Doyle dragged her down the street, the crowd followed. Not touching, not rushing, but trailing with their voices and their lenses, a living wall of witnesses. Their words clashed against Doyle's threats, echoing off brick and glass. "She's innocent. You're the criminal here. Justice will find you." The fury became something larger than fear. It became solidarity. Angela, still silent, glanced once toward the crying child on the bench. Just a flicker of her eyes, nothing more. But that glance alone steadied the girl's sobs as if Angela's strength passed straight into her. And the child, though still trembling, peeked out from behind her mother's arm, watching the woman who refused to bow. The crowd sensed it too. Angela was no longer just a woman in cuffs. She was a mirror reflecting back every injustice the town had swallowed. She was a vessel of dignity, walking with her chin lifted, so the rest of us might remember how to lift ours. And as the phones kept rolling and the voices rose higher, one truth cut through the sweltering air. Doyle thought he was teaching her a lesson, but the only lesson anyone was learning was his own shame. That was the heartbeat of the street in that moment. The squad car door groaned open its hinges, squealing like it resented the role it was about to play. Doyle shoved Angela forward, the cuffs biting into her wrists as he forced her inside. She hit the seat hard, her shoulder knocking against the frame before she slid into the back hands pinned behind her. He leaned close, his breath harsh, his words spat through clenched teeth. "This is where you belong," he growled. Angela did not flinch. She didn't spit back the anger he wanted. Instead, she turned her face toward the window, her eyes fixed on something beyond the glass, far beyond the sweaty streets of that small southern town. Her silence was deliberate, almost surgical, and I could swear you could feel Doyle's frustration twist hotter with every second she refused to answer. From the sidewalk through the car's dusty windows, I caught a glimpse of her profile. Calm, unbroken, as if she were reminding herself every word he says is a rope tightening around his own neck. Every insult will stand as evidence. My silence will be my shield and his undoing. Kane sat in the front passenger seat, his body rigid, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. He was younger, mid-20s at most, the kind of man still carrying the unease of a rookie beneath the uniform. His jaw worked tight like he wanted to say something, but didn't dare. Yet when his gaze found Angela's reflection in the mirror, something in him shifted. He didn't see fear. He saw steadiness, strength, and maybe that unsettled him more than Doyle's shouting ever had. Kane's mind flickered back to the little black girl sobbing on the bench just minutes earlier. That sound still clung to him, raw and jagged. It mixed now with the sight of this woman cuffed and cornered, but refusing to shrink. A knot of unease tightened in his chest. Beside him, Hanson settled into the seat like a man lowering himself into a recliner after dinner. His arms crossed over his vest, his voice slow and flat, dripping with practiced cruelty. Some people need to be reminded of their place, he said, as if it were a fact carved in stone. The words hung in the cramped car like smoke. Kane shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tapping against his thigh, but he said nothing. He knew better. Doyle's presence made silence the safest weapon. Doyle slid into the driver's seat, his movements harsh, each slam of his hand against the wheel, and gear shift meant to remind everyone he was still in control. He turned back, his eyes narrowing at Angela. "You think you can walk through this town like you're untouchable?" His voice cracked like a whip. "You're nothing, and nothing is what you'll go back to." Angela turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting his in the mirror. Not sharp, not mocking, just level calm, steady enough to make his words stumble for half a breath before he swallowed his own doubt. Her silence was no longer absence, it was defiance, the kind that exposes weakness in the one demanding power. The car began to roll forward, the crowd's shouts muffled as the doors sealed. But even through the glass, you could hear the chants, the voices rising behind the car like a tide unwilling to recede. Phones stayed raised, catching every glimpse of the patrol car as it pulled away. Inside, Doyle spat insult after insult, each word heavier than the last. "You people think you can rewrite the law. You people think you're equal. Let me tell you something, you'll never be more than what I tell you to be." Every sentence, every venomous syllable, Angela absorbed without reply. Her eyes stayed fixed on the window, watching the town blur past. Brick storefronts, weathered signs, the courthouse dome, in the distance, it all reflected against the glass, but her gaze was further beyond. She looked like a woman staring not at buildings but at history itself. Kane stole glances at her in the mirror. Something about her unsettled him, the quiet dignity, the refusal to crumble, the way she seemed to carry not just herself, but every pair of eyes that had watched her be taken. He felt it then, though he couldn't name it. The humiliation Doyle meant to crush her with was becoming a humiliation for the whole force. Hanson, however, only smirked. "Keep her quiet, Doyle," he muttered. "Women like her need to learn their silence." But Doyle was already unraveling. The more Angela refused to answer, the louder he became. His voice filled the car, ugly and cracking, until even his insults sounded like desperation, clawing at control. And through it all, Angela sat, bound calm, her silence holding a power none of them could comprehend. She didn't need to speak, because every person watching from the sidewalk, every child who cried, every phone recording their voices, were already rising in her place. And the question burned unspoken but alive in every eye. Who was this woman who could stand so tall while chained so low? The squad car rattled as it sped over a pothole, the jolt so sharp that everything inside the cabin shook. Angela, her hands still bound behind her, leaned against the door to steady herself. And that's when it happened. Her small tote bag, the one that had slipped earlier, tumbled off the seat beside her and hit the floorboard with a soft thud. From inside, something thin and rigid slid free, catching the light as it spun across the grimy mat. It was a card, not just any card. A laminated badge, polished and official, gleamed in the dim backseat light. The embossed seal of the state flashed in silver, and across the top, bold and undeniable, were the words, "State Governor, Identification." For a heartbeat, none of us breathed. Kane saw it first. His eyes widened as if the floor itself had opened beneath him. He bent down quickly, scooping the card into his hand. The weight of it seemed to stop him cold. He turned it over, reading again, as though his brain refused to accept the letters staring back at him. His voice cracked as he called out, "Ray." "Look at this." Doyle's head snapped around his knuckles, tightening on the wheel. Annoyance at first, the kind he always wore when Kane spoke up. But when Kane held the badge higher so the light caught every detail, Doyle's expression cracked. His face drained of color like all the blood had fled at once. His mouth worked, lips moving, but no sound forming. Finally, a stammer crawled out of his throat. This can't be real." The car swerved slightly as his grip on the steering wheel faltered. He snatched the card from Kane's hand, his fingers trembling. He stared at it, then back at Angela, then at the card again, as though sheer denial might erase what his eyes refused to believe. Angela sat perfectly still, her wrists chained, her face calm. She lifted her head, her gaze steady, her silence heavier than any accusation. She looked directly at Doyle, not with anger, not even with contempt. Just a quiet certainty that seemed to unravel him further than any words could. The moment stretched long. Kane's breathing hitched. Hanson's smirk slipped his folded arms, uncrossing his posture. Suddenly not so casual. The whole car felt smaller, the air tighter, as if the walls themselves knew a line had just been crossed and there was no way back. Governor Kane whispered under his breath, almost reverently, as though speaking it aloud might shatter the air. The word hung there electric. Doyle's hands shook as he held the card. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "This is fake. It has to be fake. Some forgery." He looked back at Angela, searching her face for a tell, for a slip, for anything that could reassure him that his entire world hadn't just shifted under his boots. But Angela gave him nothing, only silence. Her eyes never wavered. And somehow that silence was louder than all the chants still echoing faintly from the street behind them. Hanson cleared his throat, but for once, his voice lacked its cold certainty. "Ray," he said low, "that seal's not fake. You know that. We've all seen it before?" Doyle snapped his head toward him, desperation flooding his face. "Shut up," he hissed. His hand gripped the card so hard it bent at the corners. "She can't be. She's not." But the truth was staring back at him in bold letters, stamped with the authority of the highest office in the state. The woman he had shoved, cuffed, and paraded through the street, the woman he had mocked as nothing was the governor. I'll never forget the silence in that car then, the way Doyle's breathing went ragged, the way Kane sat frozen eyes darting between Angela and the badge, like he was witnessing the collapse of a world he thought was solid. The way Angela, even in chains, sat straighter, her head held high as though the truth itself had lifted her back to her rightful place. That was the second climax. The revelation didn't roar. It didn't shout. It rang clear, sharp, undeniable. A secret no longer hidden, a truth crashing into the light. And for everyone watching this story unfold, there was only one thought pounding in our chests. The black woman they had humiliated in broad daylight was the state governor. Doyle tried to swallow the truth like a stone. "This must be fake," he muttered, but his hands wouldn't listen. They shook on the steering wheel, tremors traveling up his forearms, knuckles whitening as if he could grip reality hard enough to make it change. The badge lay on the console between the front seats, bright as a flare in the dark. He didn't dare look at it, but he couldn't look away either. Kane stared into the rearview mirror. Angela's face was calm, turned slightly toward the side window, her wrists still cuffed behind her. He blinked, and for a second the mirror held another image, the little black girl on the bench, hiccup crying into her mother's dress, while the sun baked the sidewalk. That sound lodged in him like a thorn. It stabbed again, now sharper, because the woman who'd steadied that child without a word was the one chained in his back seat. Hanson shifted in his chair, clearing his throat like a man preparing a speech he didn't want to give. He tried on his usual cool, the bored expression of a veteran who's seen it all, but sweat gathered at his hairline and traced a bright line down his temple. The car's AC blew hard. It didn't help. Some heat doesn't come from weather. We followed the squad car at a distance, me and half the town. It seemed drivers leaning out with phones, pedestrians jogging the sidewalks, cameras held high. Notifications pinged from pockets and purses, live streams, reposts, shaky captions that still told the truth. I watched a teenager hustling to keep up, breathless, as he read the comments out loud. "Is this real? Which town get the badge number? Tag the station. Share, share, share." By the time the car slowed at a red light, the crowd behind had doubled. A delivery van blocked the next lane, and its driver stood on the step recording over the roof. A bus pulled up, and faces pressed to the glass phones, blooming like bright squares in a dark pond. The noise changed too, no longer scattered shouts, but a hum with a spine, a chant trying to find its words. Inside the car, Doyle jabbed a finger at the badge. "It's a prop, that's all." The words came out, thin-starved of conviction. "We'll sort it out at the station." Kane didn't answer. He swallowed, throat tight. He looked again at Angela, at the stillness there, the unflinching quiet. It wasn't the quiet of surrender. It was the quiet of someone who knew how storms worked, who knew wind could rip roofs and still not shake a foundation. He turned forward before she could catch him, watching like a boy embarrassed to be learning something from the wrong teacher. Hansen forced a small laugh, a brittle thing that cracked as soon as it left his mouth. Internet's going to have fun with this, he said. The line was meant to sound in control, but his hand crept to his collar, tugging for air. At the light, someone stepped off the curb and lifted a sign that hadn't existed a minute ago, just cardboard torn from a box and a marker scrawl. "We're watching." The car's camera mount caught it, so did half a dozen phones. The signal bars on my screen pulsed as the feed climbed into the thousands. Comments raced past faster than I could read them. Doyle stomped the gas when the light turned and the car lurched. The tote on the floorboard slid. The badge wobbled on the console and tapped plastic with a sound that made everyone jump. He slapped a hand over it like you might smack a wasp. "No more games," he said, but the way his voice tripped on the word games told its own story. We curved past the courthouse. The statue on the lawn threw a long shadow, the kind of shadow that stretches into history and dares you to measure yourself inside it. More people were spilling onto the steps, office workers, a janitor with a mop handle, a kid in a pizza shop apron. They didn't rush the car. They raised their phones. They raised their eyes. They raised each other. "Look," Kane said soft before he could stop himself. Doyle looked and his jaw set. "Keep your head," he snapped. But nobody's head was where it used to be. Not in that car, not on that street, not in that town. The station came into view. So did the crowd pooling at the edges of the lot, neighbors who'd heard through a cousin, workers who'd stepped out for air, elders who'd seen too much to be fooled by noise. The hum found its sentence and rose. "Justice, justice." Not screamed. Declared. As if they were naming the thing they intended to collect and would wait as long as it took to receive it. Doyle pulled into the lane by the side entrance. Officers at the door stiffened, hands hovering near belts, eyes jumping from the car to the people and back again. A sergeant stepped forward, stopped short when he saw who was in the back seat, and then looked at Doyle with a question he didn't know how to ask. Kane picked up the badge with 2 fingers, careful as if it were made of glass. He held it low between his knees, out of sight from the windows, but there was no hiding what had already been seen. He thought he could feel the weight of the office in that card, the way a small thing can carry a whole building if you know where to place it. Doyle dragged a breath through his teeth. "We logger." Quietly, no noise. He spoke like a man giving orders to a fire: "Do not spread." The chant outside answered with its own command. "Justice. Justice." The syllables thudded through the roof. Hansen found his voice again. "We put her in the side room. Call it a mistake. Clarify later." He said it like he was building a bridge from thin air, each plank laid over a river rising too fast. "Clarify," Kane said the word brittle. Hansen didn't meet his eyes. "Story first. Facts later." Angela turned her head, then just enough to catch the reflection of Kane's face in the plexiglass. She didn't speak, but the look carried a question only he could hear. "What is your story? What is your fact?" He looked away, and in the mirror he saw the girl on the bench again, and the mother's frozen hand, in a town deciding whether to be what it had been or what it could be. Doyle opened his door. The crowd's noise poured in like weather. "Out," he ordered, voice snapping to a false crispness. He yanked open the back door and reached for Angela's arm. She rose under his hand, not resisting, not helping, standing like someone who understood exactly how little he could do and how much he already had done. She faced the station, chin-level eyes on some horizon that refused to be blocked by brick and badge. Phones rose higher. The chant rolled on. A drone buzzed above the lot like a stubborn fly, and someone from dispatch shouted for it to clear. It didn't. Doyle felt the eyes on his back. Power feels different when it's watched. It starts to weigh what it used to float on. His fingers tightened just a fraction. Kane stepped out and circled to the door, the badge still in his hand, the letters hot against his palm. He didn't show it, not yet, but his shoulders squared to something new, as if the weight in his grip had settled into his spine. Hansen came last, dabbing his forehead, with a sleeve scanning the crowd like a man trying to count a wave. Angela stood on the asphalt, cuffs bright in the sun. She looked very small and very large at the same time, small in body, large, in the way a fact becomes too big to hide. She didn't scan the faces. She didn't plead with anyone. She gazed ahead, calm and steady, with the patience of a person who trusts a storm to do what storms have always done: strip weak branches, clear the air, and leave only what can stand. The chant swelled again. Justice, justice, and the doors of the station seemed to hesitate as if even the building knew the wind had shifted. Inside, that pause power trembled. They brought Angela out into daylight and the lot erupted. Voices, cameras, the metallic buzz of a drone skimming the air. The crowd pressed to the sawhorses, a rough edge of neighbors and strangers, grief and fury braided together. Reporters muscled forward, mics thrust like spears, lenses blinking. You could feel the ground itself hum with it, the way a storm carries a charge before it cracks the sky. Doyle tried to square his shoulders, but the shake in his hands gave him away. He glanced at the badge Kane held low, then at the faces stacked 3 deep beyond the tape. When he spoke, the sound snagged in his throat. "Ma'am, we just need to clarify." The word clarify wilted in the heat. Angela didn't look at his mouth or his badge. She took a small breath, the kind that steadies a room, and set her feet on the asphalt like it belonged to her as much as anyone alive. With her wrists still cuffed, she straightened her blouse where Doyle had wrinkled it, smoothed the fabric with bound hands as best she could, and lifted her chin. "I don't need your permission to stand," she said, and her voice carried clean through the microphones, through the drone, through every pocket where a live stream was open. Then without a tremor, she finished what the town had been trying to say all day. "I lead this state." Silence hit first. It rolled out in a ring from where she stood, the way sound sometimes leaves before it returns as thunder. The reporters stopped mid-question. The chant stalled on half a syllable. Even the drone seemed to hover in place, listening. Then the lot detonated. "Justice, justice." The word wasn't a scream anymore. It was a verdict. Phones shot higher. Hands shook, some with anger, some with awe. I saw the white woman in the floral blouse slap a palm over her mouth, then grin through tears she didn't bother to hide. The teenage boys stared like someone had kicked a door off its hinges. The little black girl, the one from the bench, peeked over her mother's arm, eyes wide as if a bedtime story had climbed off the page, and stood in the parking lot. Samuel pushed to the front, breathless but grinning, the years in his shoulders suddenly light. He lifted his phone like a torch. "We have proof now," he shouted, turning in a slow circle so every camera watching from somewhere else could see what we saw: the cuffs, the badge, the woman who refused to bow. Doyle's face drained as the chant thickened and spread. He tried again, reaching for the old script. Let's keep order." But order was not his to keep. It had moved out of his hands and into the mouths of the people. Hansen flicked his gaze from Angela to the crowd, forehead shining. He opened his mouth, then shut it. For men like him, silence was a new language. Kane didn't speak either. He stood just off Angela's shoulder, the governor's ID graven in his grip, as if the weight of it had changed him from the inside out. He looked at her, at the steadiness there, and you could see a decision settling behind his eyes, slow and sure. Angela turned to the cameras, not with theatrics, not with triumph, but with the patience of someone who knows what a fact can do when it finally stands upright in public. She didn't list titles. She didn't flash the badge herself. She let the truth breathe, and the truth did the rest. A reporter found her voice. "Governor Brooks, were you Angela? Cut only the air, not the woman. Today isn't about a title," she said. "It's about dignity, mine and everyone's you tried to take." She didn't look at Doyle when she said you. She didn't need to. The chant rose again, lower, now steadier. "Justice, justice," like a drum you feel in your ribs. Somewhere behind me, a man sobbed once loudly, and then laughed through it, and then sobbed again. Doyle took a step back. He didn't mean to take. It was small, but the whole lot saw it. Power, when it retreats, always looks clumsy. He reached for a phrase that could fold this back into paperwork and codes. None came. Angela didn't move, didn't crow, didn't comfort. She simply stood, cuffed, unbent, as the center shifted around her, and the image branded itself into the day. The woman he'd tried to shrink now, taller than the station behind her, taller than the story he'd hoped to write. That was the third climax. You could feel the click of it like a lock turning from the other side. Samuel lifted his phone higher still. "The whole world's watching," he called, and he was right, because for once the truth had arrived in time. The drone dipped, the mics leaned in, the chant rolled on, and in that roar, a new quiet settled, the quiet that follows a broken spell. We weren't guessing anymore. We weren't hoping. We knew who she was and who he'd chosen to be. And from the look on Doyle's face, he knew we knew. The scene outside the station shifted from murmurs to a storm. Reporters pressed in cameras, flashing microphones thrust like arrows. Doyle's face, pale and sweat-soaked, became their target. Hansen stood beside him, stiff as stone, but his eyes betrayed him, darting desperate, already searching for an exit. Phones stayed lifted high, live streams running hot. The comments scrolled faster than anyone could read. Tens of thousands were watching now, not just in town, but everywhere the signal reached. It wasn't just an arrest anymore. It was an event, a reckoning, spilling out into the world in real time. A reporter's voice cut sharp Officer Doyle. Why was the governor of this state handcuffed in public? Doyle's lips parted, but his words stumbled before they left him. We were doing our job. The sentence died in the air. The crowd heard it not as defense, but as comedy. Laughter cracked through the chants, short, bitter bursts that burned hotter than jeers. Doyle's eyes flicked to the ground, as though maybe the asphalt would swallow him whole. Angela stepped forward, wrists still bound, her posture unbent. She didn't raise her voice, but her words landed with the weight of a hammer. Your job, she said, each syllable clean, is to protect, not to destroy. The silence after those words was sharp, like a breath held too long. Even the cameras leaned closer. The chant didn't resume right away. It waited suspended, letting her words strike. And then the wave came back louder, stronger. Justice, justice. Doyle sagged as if the chant itself pressed on his shoulders. Hansen's smirk, long gone, collapsed into a thin line. For the first time, they looked smaller than their uniforms. And then Kane moved. He stepped forward into the crush of mics and lenses, his face tight but steady. In his hand, raised high above his head, was the badge, the official seal gleaming under the sun. His voice carried over the chant, clear and unshakable. This is real, he said, his hand firm, the card steady. She is our governor. The words hit like thunder rolling down Main Street. The crowd erupted. Shouts broke, some people cheering, others sobbing outright. Samuel, the old man, wept openly as he held his phone higher, as if trying to send the moment straight into the heavens. The little girl clutched her mother's arm, staring wide-eyed at Angela, her fear melting into awe. Reporters tripped over one another, questions flying, but none could drown the sound of the people. The chant thundered, joined by tears, joined by laughter, joined by the raw sound of something too big to be contained. Angela didn't flinch. She didn't gloat. She simply stood there, bound but unbroken, as the world finally saw her for who she was. And in that instant, she was no longer just the woman humiliated in the street. She was the symbol of what they tried and failed to destroy. That was the fourth climax, the truth exposed and undeniable, and it belonged to everyone who bore witness. The parking lot had become a square, the kind of place history sometimes chooses without warning. People pressed close, not out of chaos, but out of the gravity that comes when truth finally breaks into daylight. And there in the middle of it all, Angela Brooks stood with her wrists still bound, taller than the men who had tried to shrink her. Someone had dragged over a small wooden platform, just a crate, the kind delivery men leave behind. They set it down, and without fuss, Angela stepped onto it. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. The crowd parted to let her through, as though everyone knew that if she was going to speak, it had to be where all could see. She turned slowly, her eyes sweeping the faces before her. There was anger in those faces, yes, but also tears glinting in the heat, and beneath it all, something fragile but rising hope. When Angela finally spoke, her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried with the weight of someone who had been silent until silence itself became a weapon. What happened today, she said, her words landing steady and deliberate, is not just about me. The murmurs stilled. Even the reporters who moments before had been shoving mics forward lowered their arms. It's about every voice silenced, she continued, her tone deepening, every dignity stolen. Every man, woman, and child told to shrink when they had the right to stand tall. Her eyes found the little black girl near the front, clinging to her mother's hand. Angela held the gaze for a moment, then lifted her chin higher. But we will not stay silent anymore. The crowd broke. A sound like a dam giving way surged through the lot. Some shouted, some wept openly. Many did both. The chant came back this time, not shaky, not angry, but strong, rolling: justice, justice, justice. It wasn't just a word, it was a vow. Reporters turned their lenses, but they weren't controlling the story anymore. The story was out here and the voices rising with Angela's. Behind her, Doyle stumbled, the press swarming him like bees to a hive. Microphones jabbed at his face. "Officer Doyle, did you know she was the governor? Why did you cuff her? Are you resigning?" He tried to stammer replies. We thought we were doing," but every sentence collapsed into noise, into laughter, into the rising chant that drowned him out. His career didn't end with a gunshot or a gavel. It ended with mockery. It ended with the world no longer taking him seriously. Beside him, Hanson's mask finally cracked. His shoulders slumped, his head dipped, and he stared at the ground like a schoolboy caught in a lie too large to explain. His arrogance drained away until nothing remained but shame. And Kane stood apart, the governor's badge still in his hand. His lips trembled, not from fear, but from the sting of awakening. His eyes were red, his throat working hard as he swallowed what he'd seen, what he'd done, and what he might yet become. He wasn't cheering, but he wasn't silent either. He looked at Angela like a man seeing his first sunrise after a long night. Angela turned from them at last. She didn't point. She didn't accuse. She didn't call for revenge. Her power wasn't in punishing a man, it was in showing a system for what it was. And as she stepped down from the crate, straight-backed and unbowed, she left behind more than an image. She left a message. The people saw it. They felt it. They carried it. She didn't say arrest Doyle. She didn't demand Hanson's badge. She didn't need to. What she gave them instead was heavier, harder, and more lasting a call. A call for change, not in one man, but in the whole design. As she walked toward the station doors, cuffs glinting but posture regal, the crowd thundered with voices that would not fade with the sunset. Not for a day, not for a generation. And that was the final twist. The justice Angela claimed wasn't about one officer, one insult, or one humiliation. It was about a sickness larger than a single man. She had been dragged as a victim, but she stood now as a mirror. And in that mirror, the whole system saw itself ugly and trembling. The reporters would write headlines. The videos would spread. But what stayed in the chest of every person, there was the image of a woman who never once raised her voice above necessity, never once let hatred script her story, and still shattered the power that tried to crush her. Angela Brooks didn't walk away free of chains that day. She walked away carrying them. But in her hands, they were no longer shackles. They were evidence, and the people understood. That was the ending we witnessed, not an ending of punishment, but the beginning of a reckoning. The crowd didn't go home lighter. They went home heavier, but with a weight they were ready to carry. A weight that sounded like one word repeated until it rang in the bones. What we witnessed today wasn't just a story about one woman or one officer. It was about the dignity that belongs to every human being, the courage to stand in silence, and the power of truth when it finally comes into the light. If this story moved you, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and hit subscribe to stay with us for more powerful journeys right here on Mr. Max Stories. Your support means more than numbers. It gives our team the strength to keep creating stories that speak to justice, humanity, and hope. That's what Mr. Max Stories is all about, and we're honored to have you with us.